Okay, so well, I'm really glad to be here, and thank you very much. A big part of my career over the past 40 years has been on the similarities between manufactured food and food constituents and drugs of abuse. And you'll see as I go through the talk that many, many years ago, many, many decades ago, I was talking about food as an addiction, and how this work has evolved is what this talk's about. So let's try to advance the slide. My disclosure is basically that I'm an inventor, and I'm very active in all this work, and very proud of it as well. As an inventor, you invent things, and I have a whole list of patents, but the short list is here. The last couple of them are using the food addiction model that our colleagues, my collaborators at Princeton University and our group have developed to screen for new pharmacological compounds for overeating. So that's been a big focus of our recent work, and I'll describe some of that. So I'll go through the 30 years quickly. You'll see some brain images, and you'll see how the food addiction concept, while initially ridiculed, and I was ridiculed as well, is not only caught on, but is now mainstream. How did I start thinking about this? Well, most research for me, and I'm a full-time researcher, I have 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers, is mind experiments. So I sit, and most people look at me and they go, "What are you doing?" I say, "I'm doing research." They think I'm just sitting there, but I'm thinking, and that's really how I work. So I remembered I love French fries. Dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens by me just thinking of French fries. I love French fries. I remember being frustrated by not being able to take a lot of French fries out of the little paper containers they were in, and wanting Big Mouth. And I love French fries. Then I went to Woodstock. I went to Woodstock as a medic. The one thing I learned at Woodstock, and I've published this 30 years later, is that if there's drugs and rock and roll and sex, no one says, "Where's the food?" They were really like, you couldn't get food trucks in, it was muddy, and it was like being on Fen-Phen. You forgot to eat. You forgot to eat. Then, as an addiction researcher, I worked in the area of inventing a concept for what withdrawal is and how to reverse it. So if you study withdrawal from any drug, you find that every drug withdrawal state is associated with overeating. The exception would be cannabis in acute use, but even in chronic use, you do see overeating. So this notion that we had that drugs on, food off, food on, drugs off, has been something I've studied scientifically. So for example, if you have a BMI over 40, you're significantly underrepresented as a smoker or drug user. Whereas if you have bulimia, you're significantly overrepresented. This goes back, again, I mentioned in there how I got interested with tobacco. Everyone who stops smoking gains weight, and they gain weight for a year. So it's not an acute withdrawal effect, it's chronic, and I studied that for, again, 30 years. And this is an ad used to sell tobacco, and basically it says you should smoke, especially if you're a woman, because it will give you a slender figure. And they didn't call the tennis tour for women the Virginia Slims tour for nothing. It was that marketing. So I've worked on this, and anyone who's interested in any of the scientific papers should just email me. My email is very easy. It's DR, that's an abbreviation for doctor, no periods, Mark with a K, Gold, G-O-L-D, @gmail. Now, I've worked in this area for a very long time, and these are just some of the papers we've worked on and books. And this is a 30-year summary that I'm very proud of, because if you work in AA or in recovery programs, they're always talking about taking a fearless moral inventory. So I did a 30-year review of my own work. And in that work, I said that I was a complete and absolute failure. And my friends were like writing me and asking me if I've had a midlife crisis or I was depressed. But really what it was I realized that I couldn't develop a new treatment for obesity based on my thinking, which was I need to suppress appetite. So the sea change in my work was realizing that I don't need to suppress appetite. All I need to do is make manufactured foods less reinforcing in the brain and try to get them to equal broccoli. So rather than target appetite, I targeted food addiction or food-related brain reinforcement. And to do that, first I brought together all these experts to Yale, and they taught me about their different area. And that's because in obesity medicine, there are very many people working who never speak to each other. So psychiatrists rarely speak to endocrinologists, and internists rarely speak to basic scientists. So we brought all these experts together, and Kelly Brownell, who you may know, and I hosted this historic conference. So if you just Google Yale Historic Conference, you come up with the proceedings. And there was the head of National Institute of Drug Abuse and also obesity researchers, and that enabled us to put the Food and Addiction book together, which you shouldn't buy, but I'm showing you. This is my grandson Blumenthal, and it shows that this book is really boring. They give him this book, in a Jewish tradition, they put honey on the first page and so forth, and we did all that, but no matter what we gave him, he still fell asleep. This is a boring book, but it brought together all the experts and helped me subsequently think about the field. So here you are. I'm a full-time academic. I've been academic till I retired from UF, and I still am an academic. You look at your citations. So my first paper in food as addiction is in the early 1980s, maybe 82, 83. If you remove the citations of myself and my group and my students, I had no citations for almost 25 years. So I was publishing and writing, and no one was reading it and no one was referencing it, so in a way I was completely wasting my time. Where are you guys? So this is our work in St. Kitts.
The island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. 300 years ago, a third of monkeys were brought here from West Africa along with slaves serving the rum industry. Escaped monkeys acquired a taste for alcohol by eating fermented sugarcane left in the fields.
Fermented sugarcane and alcohol.
Satisfy their thirst by raiding local bars. They have learned to be sneaky. Making the right moment is everything.
You can't make this stuff up.
For years, the monkeys have been studied for insights into our own drinking habits. Just as we vary in our taste for alcohol, so do the monkeys. Some do anything for an alcoholic cocktail. But just as some people are teetotalers, so are some monkeys. These reject alcohol in favor of soft drink.
These reject alcohol in favor of soft drink. So you have fermented sugarcane, sugar, and alcohol.
The percentage of teetotal monkeys matches the non-drinkers in the human population.
I can go forward. So if we have the next slide. Thanks. So there are a lot of other things that have come out of this work. In the same lab with me was a man who did his experiments in the island of St. Kitts, and that stuck with me from the time I left Yale. Also, of course, they injected the monkeys with the narcotic antagonist naltrexone, and by doing that, they reduced the monkeys' drinking of alcohol in the wild and also had an effect on their overall sugar intake. So think that there's a lot more similarities between sugar and alcohol, and that all supports this food addiction hypothesis. This is just an interesting new one that I thought Dr. Kushner would need to see, just because it's, again, part of the whole question that we had about bariatric approaches, ghrelin, and how does ghrelin serve as a missing link between alcohol and overeating. So everyone knows this. Obesity is a top 10 concern in the United States, but you probably didn't know that there's no medical concerns. And as somebody who worked at a major university, at the University of Florida's Student Health Service, we have 9 full-time psychiatrists and 1 part-time internist. All of the problems are in this area, and very, very importantly. So what's the lesson from St. Kitts or from our own eating? There's too many high-calorie beverages, and the result is this, the devolution of man. And that's resulted in many experts saying we needed a similar approach to what we have for cigarettes and tax soft drinks or tax sugar. And I put this up just to show you that the same advertising that was associated with tobacco, the kind of start early, develop customer, reinforcement, starts the same way. For a better start in life, start early. And that's led the Rudd Center to this kind of prevention campaign, which is that it's very important what is the intrauterine exposure, and we may talk about it at our Lunch and Learn, just about the effects of eating, epigenetic effects, and maternal eating on the development of the brain as it relates to food. And by the way, Nicole Avina, who was here last year, who's a mentee of mine, has shown that if you overfeed pregnant rats sugar-rich foods, they are born alcohol-preferring. So just in case you don't think it's true that Coca-Cola and constituents are, next video please, are, they consider themselves, that they have some drug-like qualities. Make the volume louder.
Mr. Hadley, would you like a Coke?
Never had one. What else haven't I done?
Hello?
Doris, I've always loved you. I'm your real dad.
Mr. Hadley?
I know. So to just look at the math, this is the math. And that explains why our group has worked so long and hard on the similarities in drug abuse models between sugar and fructose corn syrup and drugs of abuse. In drugs of abuse model, we give an animal a telegraph key. They've never had a drug. We hook them up to an IV, and in the IV we put cocaine. So out of curiosity, the animal hits the lever. Well, if it's cocaine, what do you think happens? They hit the lever, hit the lever, hit the lever, hit the lever, and they keep hitting it. So they develop an addiction to the drug just on the basis of opportunity, the drug's effect on the brain, and it's short-circuiting the brain's reinforcement system so that rather than wait around for a sexual or other reinforcement, they can do it just like that. So we developed an animal model where animals self-administer sugar. They self-administer fructose corn syrup. And the reason we did that was because of all the sugar here. And that's become a big part of the New York City obesity campaign, if you got that one. Thank you. So not only has the food addiction concept stood a whole host of attacks, and it has had heuristic or predictive value. You'll see that many of the new treatments for overeating are based on food addiction models. But even more, it's become a central focus for prevention campaigns and our sugar self-administration. So I think that's really positive. So clearly, animals will self-administer sugar, and while the dopamine released in the nucleus accumbens is less than released for cocaine, it's still significant, and there's no tolerance to it. So here's a good slide by the way, if you do have a good slide or find a funny video, please send it to me, because I use them. I mean, I can't be the Library of Congress, so the more help I get, the better. So here it is, basically. You eat sugar. This is not much different than other drugs of abuse. You like it. You crave it. Your blood sugar levels spike. Dopamine's released in the nucleus accumbens. You really like that. You then have drops in sugar, it falls, insulin's increased, you crave it, you take some more, and there goes the cycle. And I'd be happy, by the way, if you email me, I'll send you any original slides. Somebody who was in a lecture in St. Louis that I gave recently sent me this. This is a cartoon. You can't make this stuff up. Just like the drug model. By the way, a drug of abuse is defined by people like me, neuroscientists, as any substance that stimulates its own taking. So you give a rat a piece of desk or a podium, they'll maybe take it once, but they're not going to hit the lever till they die, and they're not going to hit the lever very often. You give them saline, nothing really much happens. But you give them there's very few chemicals that stimulate their own taking, cause anticipatory increases in dopamine, cause pleasure, and hijack the brain's reinforcement system for food and sex. Maybe 20 at the most. So we like sweets, and this was just in a Wall Street Journal publication, just to show you that there's sugar everywhere. Even if you don't add it to the food, if you look at the label, there's a lot of sugar. Because just like you smoke cigarettes and you put up with the 400 chemicals in a cigarette just for the nicotine to get into your brain quickly, you could eat this food, which is kind of the pro-molecule, just to get the sugar. And now, if you think about some of the soft drinks or the sport drinks, you get the sugar and caffeine. 2 drugs for the price of 1. Sorry. Okay. You saw Nicole last year, and I won't really go through how sugar affects the brain. If anyone's interested, she's got a nice TED lecture on it. But it pretty much is what I said. You get sugar, gets into the body, dopamine's released in the nucleus accumbens. You don't get tolerant to that. You like it. you still like it, you still like it, you still like it. And in animal experiments, both fructose corn syrup and sugar are self-administered by lab animals, but the big distinction is the fructose corn syrup animals self-administer and get obese at a higher rate. Both groups get opiate withdrawal even though they've never had an opiate. So think about this, like a pain medicine. They've never had a pain medicine. All they've done is self-administer sugar, and you give them an anti-opiate, naloxone or naltrexone, and you precipitate opiate withdrawal. So it shows you a number of things, but one that's very important is that sugars have a way to access the brain's endorphin system and cause changes in it that are similar to those produced by pain medicines. And of course, that's why some people eat when they're in pain, psychic pain or otherwise, and in animal models, we like pinch a rat's tail and they'll eat. So food could be addicting, and the good news about that is, look at my citations. My citations have gone up. I might make distinguished professor someday. It's a joke. All right, so, but in addition, I get calls now from all kinds of odd people, like the Wall Street Journal calls, or Forbes, or I said, I wrote that 35 years ago. That's not news, but to them it's brand new, and who knows. So this is another mentee of Kelly Brownell and mine, Ashley Gearhart's work on the Yale Food Addiction Scale. The good news about the Yale Food Addiction Scale is it's easy to administer. It identifies people who are food addicts, according again to the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and there'll be people who are not. It's not just people who are overweight, it's independent of that. Just like you could be an alcoholic and be white-knuckling it and not be drinking. The Yale Food Addiction Scale has been correlated to functional imaging data by Eric Stice, and you can show that there are differences in the brain between people who are Yale Food Addiction Scale positive and Yale Food Addiction Scale negative. And then the most recent use of this scale that was really innovative was Sam Klein's use, where Sam showed in a counterintuitive way that the Yale Food Addiction Scale positive person had the best response to bariatric surgery. Now, our group anticipated that finding, we think, and we've done functional imaging work that's in press to show that part of the effect, positive effect of bariatric surgery is to change food reinforcement in the brain. Many people have focused extensively on the stomach and absorption and on restrictive effects, and I think they're all wrong. The most successful effects are going to be on changing food reinforcement, just how interesting food is, just how reinforcing it is, and like we posited in the food addiction model, the key isn't to suppress appetite, it's to reduce food reinforcement, because that will be lifelong. So look at some of the items on the food addiction scale. How often do you find yourself consuming certain foods even though you're no longer hungry? That would be, the scale's easy to administer, it's free, you find it online, and it's just yes or no. How often do you worry that you should cut down on certain eatings? This is a key item and turns out in alcohol to be the #1 item on the rating scale. If you need to cut down on your alcohol intake, you are an alcoholic. That's the CAGE test for alcohol. How often do you feel sluggish or fatigued from overeating? Another item. How often do you get physical withdrawal symptoms like agitation and anxiety when you cut back? Now, this is another important item because withdrawal from a lot of different withdrawal gives you anxiety, and one of our big old-time inventions was where in the brain opiate withdrawal occurs. That's a paper of mine in 1978, and it's in an area of the brain that produces physical kind of agitation, anxiety. You eat no matter what. Do you sometimes consume the same types of food despite having problems? Neglect activities. This is something that gives you addiction plus. So there's a consequence. So for an alcoholic, they won't go to certain social events or parties because the person only serves wine. They'll say, oh, I can't go there. They just serve wine. And you go like, why not? They say, I like vodka. I'm not going to their party, or they're an alcohol-free household. So how often do negative feelings about overeating change your attitudes and change your behavior? Eating isn't as much fun. That's a tolerance thing. And do you feel significant distress on eating? And do you have impairment, like inability to keep up with your activities? You change, this is what I meant before, you change, you make choices based on that. And so they basically say, do this test and see about what would be next. And I think the test, it hasn't been proven that one treatment is better than another. And I know that Dr. Kushner wanted to talk about the practical implications. The practical implication is that we're beyond rats. We have a brain model. We know their brain changes. We know that these changes are critically important in both perception and reinforcement of certain types of food. And we now are at the point where this kind of information could dictate treatment choices. The treatment choices could be going to meetings, it could be going to meetings plus having surgery, could be going to meetings plus medicine, and that's yet to be absolutely defined. So this is since I like French fries, this is what we've used in our functional imaging. We show people French fries or logos and look in their brain. And you might be surprised to know that if you like one brand or another of fast food, just showing you the logo causes dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. So it's not dissimilar from what we've shown for cocaine, where we show an ex-cocaine addict cocaine, and their brain lights up because of anticipation. So addiction, food addiction, means that the relationship between the food and your brain is pathological, and you're pathologically attached, almost like fatal attraction, a bad lover. You know that you got to do something about this relationship, but it's almost impossible to do it, and it's impossible to do it alone. This is the target in the brain. Science, neuroscience has progressed so far that we do really understand where in the brain this occurs. We can see the nucleus accumbens. In animals, we can actually stick something in it and measure dopamine, and in humans, we can see it, and we can see the effects of manufactured food on it. Bet you can't eat just one. And that becomes a dare. So what is addiction? Addiction, the definition has been changed, in part because of work by Volkoff and our group showing that cocaine's addicting, even though it has a minor withdrawal syndrome, but it's still addicting. So when the DSM changed to allow for cocaine to be addicting, that meant gambling could be addicting. And I presented to the people who make these decisions food as an addiction. Of course, they rejected it, but they did say that depends how gambling goes as to whether they'll consider food or sex in the DSM. But nevertheless, you get craving, you get binging, you get withdrawal, you get cross-sensitization, you get more drive to the drug, increased locomotion, increased consumption, and this is what it looks like. So this is my version of what the brain looks like across species. So across species, in a rat, they have a certain amount of dopamine receptors, and a monkey has a certain amount, and a human. We use Michelangelo's David here, so just use your imagination. And as body mass index goes up, you see changes in the D2 receptor on PET scan. And the big news in this is when this was done by the National Institute of Drug Abuse at Brookhaven National Labs, the scientists could not tell the difference between a human PET scan for dopamine for obesity and a human PET scan for alcohol. So it's back to the monkeys of St. Kitts, and you can see quite clearly that there's a downregulation in dopamine from the overstimulation. So what does this mean? If you have low dopamine, you need to keep eating to get dopamine release, or keep drinking to get dopamine release. Is not to get high, it's to break even. And breaking even becomes the name of the game. So we've written about that. We think about weight. We think about dieting. The media tells us, but they haven't been much help. One thing that could help would be controlling sugar like alcohol, but it's very, very controversial and has been very hard to do. But over the past 50 years, sugar consumption has tripled worldwide. And it's very clear what's happened with alcohol taxation and tobacco taxation, and it's been a very effective public health, I should skip this, public health message. I'll send anyone the video, but suffice it to say, you didn't want to see this, suffice it to say that if it's farm to table or hunting to table, we're at no risk right now of this room being taken over by chicken McNuggets. You can't hunt for them. They won't go running by like a turkey and us go, hey, I just shot myself a chicken McNugget. Good luck. So what's in it, there are nice descriptions, both scientifically and otherwise, but the bottom line is it's made to stimulate its own taking. That's the point. Just put yourself, you're in a capitalist society, put yourself in the mode of, you own a fast food restaurant. Do you want one where people come in and you serve them a piece of paper, rice cake? They'll never come back. They're certainly not going to get dopamine release when they see your logo. I mean, you want something that says, pay attention. That was good. I feel better. And I'd like to do that again. So what's the similarities between drug abuse and food? Drugs increase the dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Food the dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. Opiate antagonists, it's all pretty much the same. What are the current treatments? Blame the patient. Now, the reason I started with this is because, keep in mind, I worked at Yale for many years, and in my early work in addiction, we were not allowed to admit an alcoholic to the hospital. And I bet you remember the time that was commonplace at all academic medical centers. You could admit them to medicine if they had hepatitis or cirrhosis, but you couldn't admit them otherwise. That's where AA came in, the church basement and so forth. For tobacco smoking, we spent the first 30 years that I worked on tobacco, and I've written textbooks on tobacco, blaming the patient. They'd come in and go, you need to stop smoking. If you don't stop smoking, you're going to get cancer. And doctors as a group failed miserably because that's not a treatment. That's blaming the person. We tell people to go on a diet. What diet? I don't know what diet. I have daughters and daughter-in-law who've been recently had a baby, and they went to their gynecologist. They're both doctors, OB/GYN, and said, what diet should I have during my pregnancy? And they said, it doesn't really matter as long as you don't gain more than this amount of weight. That's not a diet. That's not even evidence-based. We tell people to read a book. I think the most recent data was that if you looked at gyms, books, all these other self-help is about 95% of the obesity spending. So I think psychoeducation is a treatment. It's underutilized. one approach to cognitive psychoeducation would be change the plate. In functional imaging, if you have a big plate, your brain feels cheated unless the plate's full. You need plate art to fill the plate up so your brain doesn't think you're cheating it. Change the plate. One of my older daughters got married. She asked my wife to see our plates, our wedding plates, and we've been married 45 years. So she showed her, and she said, I didn't mean the salad plate. They changed the size of the plate on us, and nobody noticed. That's very important. Eat slowly. Our group showed in functional imaging that if you're a thin person, the food signal takes about 12 minutes to reach the brain. So that's still 12 minutes. And if, as you increase the BMI beyond that, it takes longer and longer. And it can take 30 minutes for the first signal to reach the brain after you begin eating. So when you say eat slowly, that means painfully slow. Pretend you're French and you have nothing to do. Watch the sizes. We're in the middle of a size creep. So watch the sizes. Portion control is very important. And as I said about myself and French fries, I used to be able to not fit my fingers in. There were maybe 8 French fries in a French fry container. And that's certainly not the case anymore. And that's now a part of the prevention. This is kind of called psychoeducation. What is in various, you got that? If not, I can skip it. But this is, again, a state of New York thing.
That's how much we eat and what we consider an appropriate serving.
How about a baked potato then?
Well, okay. Over the years, our portion sizes have gotten bigger and bigger. And some experts say it's distorted our idea of what a typical meal should look like. The trend toward larger sizes began in the 1970s and then ballooned in the 80s and 90s. So we've rounded up some of our favorite foods from the past and today. Check it out. So you grab this blueberry muffin on your way to school. Now this one muffin has 370 calories and it's 4 ounces. Now in the past, muffins were about 1.5 ounces. That's the equivalent of 2 of these mini muffins.
They're not mini muffins. Those are the muffins we had in the 60s.
So maybe you're not the muffin type. How about a bagel? Well, if we take a look at this bagel, these are what bagels used to look like. And if we measure it, you can see it's about 3 inches across. You could never find a bagel bigger than this. These days it's easy to do. If we take a look at this bagel, measure it, over 4 inches. Now it's time for a morning pick-me-up, and that means coffee. Now most of you guys are not picking up this cup of coffee. Instead, you're choosing this 20-ounce venti from Starbucks. Now coffee itself, it doesn't have a lot of calories, but it's the milk, the sugar, and the cream that do, and today we're adding more and more of it.
Okay, so the popcorn obviously has quadrupled, and you've seen all that. It's very, very important. But the brain and my work changes to accommodate for these things so that in a way you are used to, you're almost tolerant to these changes. So if somebody gave you a small portion, your brain would say, the host was cheap. They're not generous. So what could we do? We could eat less of certain things. Salt's certainly one of them. Fast food's another. All these kind of sugar and constructed foods that are designed as smart bombs, if you will, to stimulate their own taking. I'll go back to being a German Jewish person. I used to say that my family helped me a great deal in this field because my grandmother used to say, if you like it, it's bad for you. And she certainly cooked like that. I needed to marry Janice Finn to get like any food that was even decent. So there is this whole notion, the more changes, the more variety, the more brain reinforcement. So if you think about food like sex, the more variety, the more interesting. And the same would apply with food choices. We have so many choices that we set up maximum dopamine release just by switching from Mexican food to deli to steak. Every switch gives us maximum reinforcement. And you could almost construct a diet by any food you like. Just eat it until you're bored to death. We need to exercise more. Now, Dr. Kushner and I have told people to exercise, so when I was at Yale, we would say to people in hedge funds to exercise, and that's walking the dog in Greenwich. Be in groups. Group approach is better than alone. Alone is isolation. It's almost impossible for an alcoholic to be treated without a group, a support group, somebody that's been there, somebody as a guide, and that's very important. So how is it possible that's one disease? It's impossible. And the food addiction scale is one way to separate people out. This is kind of good work, isn't it? I thought that I'd show you that even surgery is going to be seen as a brain intervention. Another clue to the food addiction hypothesis is one of the main complications of bariatric surgery is developing an addiction. If you look at the long-term outcomes, it's depression and addiction. Those are pretty much it. Okay, so why isn't there a safe weight loss pill, CNN asked me. And I said, it's easy, because we've been focused on appetite. Appetite is probably not really suppressible. It's too important. It would be like, what would you need to do in the brain to eliminate a sex drive? Good luck. There are new treatments out there for diabetes that have been approved. There are new treatments for, this is missing the headline, sorry. Old treatments that have been around, both for type 2 diabetes that have effect on weight loss. Glucophage is used very actively for medication-induced weight gain in psychiatry. And by the way, there's a new report last week on naltrexone comparison to glucophage in antipsychotic-related weight gain. And I think you'll see more of that. There are all kinds of new treatments, and many of them are based on addiction models. So without going through the great detail, if a treatment includes phentermine, it includes an amphetamine, and I already said drugs and food compete in the brain for the same reinforcement site. That makes sense. If it includes phentermine plus topiramate, topiramate's used for alcohol craving. So many of the new treatments are being constructed on the basis of food addiction model or on the basis of glucose and insulin. So, you know, there's exceptions to that. Serotonergic treatment. This is a treatment that's kind of related to our try for 60 milligrams of Prozac or 80 milligrams of Prozac, but it's based on the fact that the brain has a lot of different receptor systems, and one of them, the 5-HT2C system, is very relevant to overeating. And that's the basis of that. If you knock out mice, they just eat continuously. You probably know that this month the new medicine was approved, which is again a combination of bupropion and naltrexone. Again, two treatments used in addiction. I was part of the pivotal trial of bupropion and smoking cessation, which is a medicine approved for helping people to stop smoking. And naltrexone is a medicine that helps people stop drinking or drink less. You know, as I said in St. Kitts, if you give animals an injection of naltrexone, they drink less, they don't stop. So you add them together, two logical food addiction treatments. And this was the pivotal trial looking at dose responses of these combinations. So for people who've worked in food addiction, they feel very validated by the modern experience. Food and food constituents have drug-like qualities. Sugar and fructose corn syrup are self-administered as if they're drugs of abuse. Manufactured food stimulates its own taking to the point of loss of control and food addiction, with similar brain imaging findings between alcohol dependence and food addiction. And based on that model, we have public health approaches, tax it, like cigarettes, and we also have new treatment approaches, take the treatments that are given now for prevention of relapse or reducing brain reinforcement caused by alcohol and apply them to certain subtypes of obesity, and that subtype is the subtype we call food addiction. So with 6 seconds left, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention and inviting me here. I got to spend the Jewish holidays with my mother, and it was really a blessing on all of us, and I thank you for bringing me here for that. Thank you.